Hello, everyone. I am Mohammed Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to another session of our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series. We are grateful to Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for funding the establishment of the Iranian Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I also like to express our solidarity with the inspiring women's movement in Iran and our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I welcome Dr. Pardis Minuchehr to the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. Today, Dr. Minuchehr speaks on how women claim their rights on or off screen. My colleague, Professor Golbag Rekabtalai, will be introducing our speaker and moderate today's session. Professor Rekabtalai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tawakkoli. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today and spending your Friday afternoon with us. Let me just take this opportunity to also echo Dr. Tawakkoli's statements of solidarity with women in Iran and also the Indigenous population in Canada and around the world. Today, I have the honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Pardis Minuchehr. So Dr. Pardis Minuchehr received her Ph.D. from Columbia University in Comparative Literature and Middle Eastern Studies, focusing on the Iranian diasporic press during the Constitutional Revolution in the beginning of the 20th century. She has taught Persian language, literature, and film courses at various institutions in the United States, including the University of Pennsylvania, George Washington University, the University of Virginia, as well as Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey, and has been the recipient of a Fulbright Award at the Free University of Berlin. Her research and publications focus on issues related to the Iranian diaspora, gender justice, postmodernism, decolonization, and trauma. Recently, she curated the virtual Pendar Film Festival with a main focus on women of Iran during the pandemic. She currently teaches Middle Eastern literatures and cultures at California State University, Long Beach, and I believe that next semester she will be teaching at California State University, Santa Barbara. And with that, I would like to ask Dr. Pardis Minuchehr to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rekabtalai. Thanks for that kind introduction. I first want to thank the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, and more specifically, Professor Mohammed Tawakkoli, for this invitation to talk today. And I'm very happy to see that Dr. Mir-Djalali herself, and I thank her immensely as well. When we discussed actually this the topic for this talk several months ago, when I was in Toronto in May, I believe, we had no idea how women's rights would emerge and would emerge and become the first page of news, and that women's rights will lead the way for a revolutionary movement in Iran. I had started to write an entry for the encyclopedia on Iranian cinema compendium, which Professor Tawakkoli kindly asked me to on women's cinema in Iran. And we decided that we talk about my findings from this research for this talk. It was serendipity, I guess, that it coincided with this particular historical juncture, and we see how theoretical discourse has now come into practice. In other words, revolution and women's rights is no longer only an idea, but one that is pursued by activists on the streets and in public arena like never before. When I started writing about women's cinema in Iran, it coincided with the issuance of this Me Too petition, or the communique of 800 women in cinema in Iran. This 800 women communique, or Bayaniye 800 Zan, written and signed by women in the film industry, concentrated on expressing opposition to the sexual abuse and power dynamic in the film industry. But it also spoke deeply to the concerns of the whole society. In other words, it was not only about the concerns of the film industry, but it was the plights of women in Iran as a whole. This communique soon became controversial. The state, of course, shunned it. Many men disavowed it, and even some women dismissed it. But in reality, it cut to the core of problems regarding gender relations in Iran. This was unheard of. 800 women, many celebrities in the film industry, signed a communique opposing violence against women. A communique that not only stated the problem of sexual abuse, the problem of a power dynamic that made harassment and abuse of women possible, and it exposed the threatening environment inside Iran. But what distinguished this document from others was that it also offered comprehensive solutions and took proactive steps to respond. Address to Khane Sinema, the House of Cinema, which is the organization bringing all different cinematic syndicates under one umbrella. As mentioned, this bayaniye or communique went beyond merely efshagari, exposing and revelation of abuse, but it carefully and diligently offered solutions to the problem. It is important to note that Iranian cinema has been a site of cultural resistance for many decades. And with this document, stems from what is called the Iranian Me Too movement. Important to know that the Iranian Me Too movement also started from cinema and from women in cinema. Women thus spearheaded a call for cultural change and transformation. It is not shortly after this call that we witness and are now amazed of the bravery of women in the public, and we see the unflinching support and steady expression of solidarity with women in Iran and outside of Iran, where they stand with the women life freedom movement, with the Zan Jian Azadi or Zan Zendegi Azadi movement that Professor Tawakkoli also referred to in the beginning of his talk. In fact, I want to argue here that the current women's movement that we see in Iran wasn't created out of a void and didn't suddenly erupt as some wish to convey, but it is indeed grounded in decades of women's struggle. It is no coincidence, I believe, that this major revolutionary movement occurred only a few weeks after this bayaniye, this communique, was issued and signed by 800 women, many of whom were activists of the Iranian Me Too movement. In other words, how can we identify women life freedom movement today as the outcome of decades of struggle, defiance, and resistance, which has now been crystallized into a revolutionary movement that has been identified by many of a cultural shift paradigm, but not only a cultural shift paradigm for Iran, but for humanity as a whole. It is also important to note that this movement is inspirational not only for the women of Iran, but for women all over the world. And it begs a question as why is that so? The Women Life Freedom Movement, which erupted following the death and the arrest and death of Mahsa Amini, symbolizes a new era in women's rights. One could argue, as I said, not only Iran, but also international. Today, we see major demonstrations of support not only on the streets of Iran, but major cities across the world. I think in Toronto, you had one of the biggest demonstrations there in support of women's rights for Iran. In Berlin, there was like 80,000 to 100,000 on the streets. In Los Angeles, I saw over 20, 30,000 on the streets. In LA, and in New York, Washington, DC, San Francisco, and many, many other cities around the world. And what is important, what is fascinating about these demonstrations is that they have not stopped, and they are ongoing. They are regularly organized, they are well attended, and they are forceful. And because of the public display of the movement just now, some believe that this women's movement just commenced in September 2022, but disregarded the reality that women's rights campaigns in Iran go back actually several decades. For several decades, Iranian women have cried out for their rights. But with this new age, new modes and new media has come to the assistance of women's rights groups. And cinema in Iran plays a considerable role in breaking that silence about women's issues. A look at the history of cinema in Iran tells us of the significant role women played in it, whether as directors, producers, actors, or film crew. Ever since its inception, women have gotten over a lot of obstacles to succeed and to overcome obstacles of gender and sexuality. As Taraneh Ali Dosti, the Iranian actress who's been also very active in this Me Too movement and in this communique, she stated in one of her interviews about the reasons behind this movement. She said, this situation, meaning the ongoing abuse and the abusive dynamic in Iran, can no longer continue. So what are the remarkable feats of women in cinema included their efforts to break the silence and push traditional boundaries, breaking taboos, both on screen and off screen. So today I wish to explore the cultural, social, and political context within my time limits of the current women's movement and how cinema in Iran, especially women's cinema, paved the way for critiquing and questioning the place of women in Iranian society and pushed for new ways and new perspectives to claim their rights. In the past decade, many women, we know many women like Rakhshan Bani Etemad, Tahmine Milani, Manijeh Hekmat, Niki Karimi, Mania Akbari, Marzieh Makhmalbaf, Samira Makhmalbaf, Hana Makhmalbaf, the two sisters, and the mother, actually Mohsen Makhmalbaf's wife is Marzieh Makhmalbaf, and many, many others have made remarkable movies about women and for women. But one of the most remarkable films made about women with profound social impacts in Iran, I would argue, is Puran Derakhshande's His Dokhtarha Faryad Nemizanand, which has been translated as Hush, Girls Don't Cry. But from now on, I will refer to this film as His, because I think the onomatopoeic word His actually conveys the meaning of this forced, imposed silence. They're silencing them. In His, a bride-to-be commits an unthinkable crime on the day of her wedding, murdering the superintendent in the building complex. In the very beginning, in the wedding scene, we see the entrance of a shocked woman in a white, bloodied gown. And most of the rest of the film takes place in the judiciary's court setting and depicts her life behind bars with flashbacks to her childhood and just the scene of the crime. Now I have the trailer here I can share with you. Do you think this is a good time to share the clip? Hopefully you can hear it.
چی میخواد از دست مراد فرار کنه؟
یعنی یه دونه میخوام درست کنم رنگ لباسش.
آبرو تو میبرد، آبروی خود خانواده.
قربانی خانواده قربانی به دلیل حفظ آبرو روی جنایتکار سرپوش میذارن و با اون در واقع همدست میکنن.
بچه من یه دقیقه از این خونه بیرون نمونده تعلق
شهاب حسینی، مریلا زارعی، طناز طباطبایی، بابک حمیدیان، امیر آقایی، جمشید هاشمپور، فرهاد آیش، هادی مرزمان، مائده طهماسبی، شیرین بینا، نیما صفایی. هیس. دخترها فریاد نمیزنند. تهیه کننده و کارگردان پوران درخشنده. محبوب ترین فیلم 31مین جشنواره فیلم فجر به انتخاب تماشاگران. پخش از فیلم ایران.
Okay, so I think you got an idea of the film. While I'm talking about it, it makes it a little bit a better impression of what I'm talking about. So, as I mentioned, the very beginning in the wedding scene, we see the entrance of a shocked woman in a white bloodied gown of a bride to be. But the rest of the film is about her dilemmas, her plight, in the court. And at first she doesn't want to explain her situation, but then there are a lot of flashbacks. There is the sympathetic ear of her lawyer, played by Merilah Zarei, and the bride, who's played by Tanaz Tabatabai, gradually, slowly breaks her silence and tells the tale of her abuse. It is a difficult story of sexual abuse that she faced throughout her childhood. As a child, she tried multiple times to say something about this enduring abuse in the film, she says, but she was told by adults to keep her silence, not to say anything, and she was silenced with this hiss. She could never say anything about her ordeal, which caused this pent-up emotions and major rage in her. For those of you who have not seen Hiss, at the end of the film, it becomes clear that when she heard her neighbor's girl being abused by the janitor in the building, the bride-to-be took justice into her own hands, and even though she was wearing a white bridal gown and getting ready to go to the altar, she went and she took justice into her own hand. She spilled the blood of the abuser right there and then with a knife. So this film is actually very impactful. It was very impactful in Iran, was a commercial film. It wasn't like considered to be an independent movie like a lot of the other movies that we teach on our film classes. This was something that was a commercial trade. People went, lay people from all walks of life, from all generations, went to watch it, and it spoke to a lot of people. What is interesting is that the film critiques socially accepted cultural constructs on multiple levels. First, it criticizes a culture that requires the abuser to keep her silence about the abuse. So the he is, to keep your silence. Don't say anything about, the kind of abuse that you're facing. This enforced silence is thus culturally and socially imposed because it's imposed to save face. So what is in Persian called aberudari, a commonly known concept in Iran. But the problem with this aberudari, saving face and keeping reputation, is that it allows predators to continue their abuse. And in reality, it devalues feminine individuality. And at the same time, it suppresses the trauma caused by this abuse. So he's is a critique, actually, of that silence. It is a critique of the cultural traditions that disregards the abused women and allow abusers to be roaming the society at large. This aberudari, therefore, does not acknowledge the voice of the victims. It does not recognize pain and suffering endured by women victims, and it does not see women as individuals with rights, but merely as part and parcel of a social construct mandated to behave and act in a certain way. When this film was screened in Iran in 2013, it became, as I mentioned, it became a commercial hit. It also became a film of interest not only for human rights activists, women rights activists, but also caused many discussions amongst lay women who were not otherwise thinking actively about sexual abuse and its dire impact on society. The end of the film is particularly saddening and tragic, as the director shows how the uncompromising justice system has failed victims of abuse by handing down a death sentence to the bride. The film ends with her looming execution. Thus, the film is also a critique of the judiciary and the justice system that executes a woman without taking into consideration her mental disposition as an abused woman, and merely sees and interprets laws based on the surface of it, rather than going deep down into its social, cultural, mental, and emotional causes. As you saw in the trailer gives you an impression of the social drama, and because of its commercial release and the fact that it was, watched by many, it's sort of entered the collective consciousness. So this is almost 10 years old, made almost a decade ago. And as a result of this film, actually, there were many working groups that were created to address some of the issues of abuse that Pardis Minuchehr brings to light here. And almost a decade later now, we see in the communique of the 800 women that they also demanded accountability for violators, for predators who had for years abused women and not been held accountable for their harassments, or in some cases, rape and sexual harassments. So like another commercially released movie, Mali and her Untaken Path, Mali و راههای نرفته‌اش, directed by Tahmine Milani, addresses the issue of domestic abuse or domestic violence. Mali and راههای نرفته‌اش revolves around the life of a woman who enters a relationship with much hope and expectations, but she gradually realizes an abusive power dynamic where she endures long durations of physical and sexual abuse. So this is like about 5 years difference between Puran Derakhshanda's his and Tahmine Milani's Mali. But I want to share with you the trailer for Mali, just to give you also an idea of Tahmine Milani's style in this film.
حتما این کارو بکنید.
یه بار تو
Okay. So that was just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. This is Mali or Malihem and Rahay Naraftash, Mali and Untaken Path. Actually, the translation, the film has been translated into English as the just Untaken Path. And it revolves around the life of a woman who enters a relationship with much hope and expectations, but she gradually realizes an abusive power dynamic where she endures long duration of physical and sexual abuse. What Mali naively perceived as a loving relationship turned into one of fear and isolation. She remained in the abusive relationship to save face, the same aberudari that we talked, the social construct of aberudari. She also remained silent to the outside world about what she was enduring for long extended times. She kept silent for a long time about her pain and suffering and about her abuse. Mali sheds light on the dire impacts of domestic violence, an issue that is considered to be a public health concern in Iran today. There are empowering women programs planned through education and career planning, as well as awareness raising campaigns, but this empowerment has not been completely achieved. For the most part, because the laws in support of women's rights are either non-existent or they're not properly codified to cover domestic violence. Tahmin Milani's Mali begins with a scene that shows Mali making a call from the trunk of a car. She's held captive by her suspicious, abusive husband. It is not until the end of the film that we find out that once Mali gets out, she attacks her husband with the metal tool in the back of the car and beats him unconscious. She then flees into a train nearby and commits suicide by taking a bottle of pills, a tragic ending for both. Actually, I was present for a special screening of the film in 2018 when it had just come out. And there I met Tahmin Milani in the Cinema Azadi Cineplex screen when she was screening of her film. And Masume Ebtekar, who was the Minister for Women's Issues, was actually present at that screening too. So it was obvious that Tahmin Milani's intentions with the film and with inviting, people from the government or from women's rights, from women's office, was that her intention was to highlight the plight of abused women, but she also wanted to take action and proactive, to be more proactive. And therefore, there was this discussion with the Minister of Women's Affairs there in the, after the film screening in the hallway, not as a panel. I had a private talk with Tahmin Milani then, and where she we talked about this, and she said that she wanted to make sure laws addressed against women were ratified and were included in the civil code of Iran. But it occurred to me that Tahmin Milani viewed the role of her film as a catalyst for the necessary social change, a cultural change that needs to be ultimately codified for it to be effective. Women filmmakers thus sought to raise awareness, create a space for collective consciousness of issues related to women and women's rights, and providing a space that would lead to the possibility of codifying laws in support of women. In March 2022, when the communique of 800 women was signed and sent to Khane Sinema, they no longer tiptoed on issues and explicitly stated their intention in the document of codifying laws against violence, albeit only within the House of Cinema organization, but laws that would ultimately serve as a model for other organizations and perhaps the entire state. The 800 Women communique's intention, they wrote, is to make a safer space, one that allows them to operate without dreading the abusive power dynamic. In conclusion, I want to say that Iranian women have been inching their way into gaining rights. Their struggle, silenced and suppressed, has now erupted in the form of a revolutionary uprising embodied in women life freedom. While this eruption may be silenced once more, as it always have been throughout history, it cannot be stopped. This time, the transformation has its roots in the tireless efforts of numerous artists and filmmakers who slowly, and many others, of course, who slowly but surely have pushed back against the forced silence against traditional social and cultural constructs, breaking established taboos. Film stands as a perfect medium to break the silence, as we witness today. Iranian women are spearheading what many have identified as a paradigm shift in humanity. The Iranian Me Too movement, meaningfully emerging out of the ranks and files of the cinema industry, shows how Iranian cinema operates as a site of resistance, one that eventually should and would facilitate cultural transformation, culminating into codes that create safer spaces for women to dwell in. And it is fascinating to be witnessing the outcome in the coming future. Thank you again, Professor Tavakkoli, and everybody at the University of Toronto and all the audience here. And I will be open to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an intriguing and relevant topic that you shared with us, Dr. Minuchehr. With that, we're going to open it to questions. You can either raise your hand to ask questions. I will call your name, or you can put your questions in the chat section for us. First question by Guna. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. So I have two questions regarding your presentation. The first question is about the movie Takmin Emilani's Untaken Path. In the end, you said that the protagonist committed suicide. So how would you interpret the act of suicide? Like, was it out of frustration, or was it a form of resistance against the society? So that is my first question. And the second question is that those films that you presented seem to show that women as a protagonist, that they are able to fight against silencing patriarchal violence. But what I wonder is whether there are some male characters showing support or helping women fighting against like those silencing patriarchal violence, or women protagonists, are they like trying to build ally with some men? Because that's what we are witnessing in this like current women life freedom movement, right?
Those are very good points. They're very good points. Actually, yeah, my interpretation of the ending is that she takes things into her own hand. Plus, when Mali commits suicide, she basically asserts agency in a way. She takes agency in her own hand and says, okay. And plus, she's in a stalemate situation. She has committed murder, and there is nowhere for her to go. She's already alienated from her family. She is she has nobody else to go to. So basically, she commits suicide, but it's not clear at the very end if she survives the suicide or not. That's what Iranian films are about. You don't know the ending at the very end. It's always vague and ambiguous for a reason. But also about the men. Your second question, to address your second question, yes, there, in the beginning of the film, he's the bridegroom doesn't understand why the bride, commits this murder right as they are about to get married. And he doesn't know that past. He doesn't know that she comes from an abused past and has gone through this, mental anguish for such a long time. So what she is basically, what he breaks all ties with her until he understands. And then once he understands, then you see that, the groom also coming and accompanying the bride-to-be, who is already now in prison and on death row. So yeah, there is, that's a good point, in this movement too. You see that, actually a lot of men who are advocates for women's rights, and this is a fantastic thing. And of course, yes, before it's happening on the streets, I think it happened in the cultural scene. So I talked about the cinema here, but theater was amazing and has been amazing, especially in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, with theater, you don't get the same kind of exposure here, but it's that scene is something that has been very effective for the cultural transformation that I'm talking about. So, but thank you for those two questions.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. There is a question in the chat section, which I'm going to read for you, by Nilufar Purzand. Thank you for your talk. Don't you think even more than gender sensitive, these movies are mostly about gender-based violence and overall oppression of women, though there might be some form of resistance, but don't seem to be enough about other lives of women and other aspects of women's lives. And at the end, she asks, what do you think about the Holy Spider? So the question is basically, instead of just being about gender-based violence, a lot of these films, I guess, don't seem to be about other aspects of women's lives. So if you can maybe talk about that a little bit and then tell us about your thoughts on the Holy Spider.
Okay, first about the Holy Spider, I think it sounds like a fascinating movie. Unfortunately, I had tickets to go see it, but had to go to a conference, so I haven't seen it yet. So, but I have heard fascinating things about it. But I'm not sure what you mean by them not being about other issues of lives of women. There are a lot of films by women and on women about many other aspects of women's lives, but I just selected the two films I selected for this presentation was just to give these are examples, and they're definitely not they're not conclusive, and there are a lot of other examples, but I just wanted to give you an impression of the kind of films that has been produced in Iran in the last 10 years, specifically about the issues of women's rights. And since my talk was about women's rights, I wanted to concentrate on these aspects of women's rights. But yeah, of course, absolutely, there are. I don't know if that's that answers the question. Or
there is a question by Jamila Dawoodi. I'm going to read it for you. Movies such as Holy Spider would never get permission to be made in Iran. This brings out the point that cinema in Iran could only stretch as far as the government would allow. I guess it's more of a comment than a question.
Yes,
but if
actually,
you have any thoughts on that, yeah.
Yes, no, that's a very, very good point. Actually, yes. So the two films that I mentioned here, the examples that I gave, were definitely created within those confines of the state, the censorship laws, and the very restrictive censorship. So that's why it's even more valuable what they're doing, considering that they are, coming from a patriarchal society and from a brutal kind of perspective and point of view that is definitely not, it's very different from being made in the, in the West and the outside world. So Holy Spider, of course, was what made in Europe, so definitely didn't have those restrictions. Yes, but what I heard, and now I don't know if this is something that is valid or reliable news or not, but what I heard is that now they're making two kinds of movies in Iran. One is, with hijab, and one is without hijab, for instance. So in case that there is a the government is overthrown, then they can show, or the laws with hijab are relaxed, then they could show the ones without hijab. So this is, I don't know how truthful this is, but maybe some of you may have more news about this. But this is something that is happening. So with the revolution, with the uprisings in Iran, there's also a lot of change happening that is not coming, that we don't know right now, but it's happening in the background.
Thank you. I actually read about that too, and I was wondering about its credibility, but it seemed to be coming from very credible sources. So it's interesting to see. Ahsa, if you're still not ready, maybe or you are? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Minuchehr, for this wonderful talk. I mean, I'm saying wonderful because it was vicarious. Your examples were very identifiable and relatable as a woman who has gone through and grown up in a society where these things are considered very normal and condoned. I'm interested in your interpretation of suicide as the emancipatory gesture in this film, Melani's film. I would like to follow up on Gunha's question, and I would like to ask you, to what extent do you think that suicide as a freeing gesture in the film, or as an emancipatory gesture in the film, is to accommodate the film's release in Iran and to deal with the censorship that may not allow it to be released had the protagonist have another kind of emancipatory possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen this is an excellent question, actually, by the way. I don't know if you've seen other Tahmina Milani films. Actually, I wanted to talk about it, but then my talk was getting longer, and I said, let me cut it short. But if you've seen, a lot of Tahmina Milani's movies, is that she has a lot of feisty, gutsy female protagonists in her films, like Atash Bas, a Ceasefire, or other movies that she's made. There, she brings these feisty women out there, and she could have, I think that she knows now, after making movies over 20, 30 years in Iran, she knows how to get by those. And I don't think that, I think this was a deliberate decision on her part I mean, it had nothing to do with, I don't think so, but, I'm not in her head to read that, but I don't think that she had another, I mean, this was a deliberate option there to show that, in spite of her naivete, but she also had agency throughout this part, but she had no choice. She had to succumb to that kind of abuse. But that's, I mean, there are definitely multiple endings for film, so would be interesting to explore that too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may just use my privilege here to also make a comment about that, because it's been brought up a couple of times. I also found this really fascinating. I'm actually working on an article on mid-century films and women in mid-century films, mid-20th century films, and I'm actually working on what I call bad women of cinema, with the femme fatale kind of character in these films. And interestingly, the desiring woman usually is killed at the end of all these films, whereas the woman, the fallen woman, if she repents, a lot of times, she's redeemed at the end of the films. So for me, I mean, that is symbolic of the fact that kind of the project of modernity failed women in the mid-century cinema, where, their desires basically were not acknowledged in a way, or not necessarily seen as part of the project of modernity. So for me, it was interesting to also see this here, whereas it's as if the woman is considered as, she's not a fallen woman, she's not a bad woman, she's in the right, of course, throughout the film, but death again seems to be the only answer to, the life of a woman in that situation. And
Absolutely.
I also,
I'd love to read your article. That's really, yes.
I'm working on it. I'll send it to you once it's done, for sure. Also, Niloufar Pourzan said something in regard to this question. I'll read it for you, and then we can move on to the next question. Niloufar says, it is perhaps also symbolic to remember the first ever made Iranian movie was about a woman, Dokhtare Lor, which of course was quite important as one of the first modern women that were screened
Yes.
on Iranian cinema.
I am very fascinated with Sepanta and all of her. So that's also a different, yes. And the Dokhtare Lor was, it was the first Iranian movie, but it was not made in Iran, right? It was made in India, in Bombay, but it's very, very fascinating, very fascinating. Yeah, very good point, but excellent point.
Dr. Pourzan has provided just a description of Dokhtare Lor, the Lor girl, the first talkie Iranian film, or Iranian cosmopolitan film, because it was made in India, for anyone who's interested.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Abulfaz, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your illuminating talk. I just wanted to know whether you see any difference between the stylistic approach that Tahmina Milani has to her films, and because she's the screenwriter of most of her films, so she knows exactly what to expect to come out of her film, versus the screenplays and the movies that are made by Rakhshan Bani Etemad, and the way that they're trying to convey their message, especially regarding patriarchy, because Tahmina Milani is right up front, and we know that what she's attacking patriarchy head on. For me, for example, for some of Rakhshan Bani Etemad, they're more subtle messages rather than showing the naked patriarchy in the society in Iran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are very valid points. There is definitely a stylistic difference between Rakhshan Bani Etemad and Tahmina Milani, basically because of their history too, because the Rakhshan Bani Etemad and Puran Derakhshande, for that matter, they come from a documentary tradition. They both were, documentary filmmakers in the TV, in the television, national TV of Iran before the revolution. So they're also coming from the same generation. Whereas, Tahmina Milani's films are more fictional. I mean, now this Mali is more on social drama and it could resemble documentary. But for Rakhshan Bani Etemad, definitely, you see even with her fictional films, you can trace that documentary, that she is documenting and recording plights and social malaise. It's a little bit definitely stylistically. Yeah, you have a good point. There is that difference. So there are, in the chat, I see there's a long.
So Ashraf Rahmani writes, thank you for your inspiring talk. You mentioned that the toxic cultural idea of aberudari, or facing face, is actually one of the beliefs that affect Iranian women not to be able to have their rights. Do you think that such toxic beliefs affect women more than getting their rights through codifying laws through the government system?
Yeah, I mean, that whole social and cultural construct. It's not only aberudari, that is part and parcel of this patriarchy or patriarchal perspective of life. So that is definitely, yes, it is definitely affecting women in getting that recognition and that possibility to get those laws passed. But it's also, the Iranian system. I mean, now it has become clear that the current, Islamic Republic of Iran, the vision, the system is not going to lead to any kind of women's recognition of women's rights, or reforms for that matter. They've tried that for the last 44 years, I think. Not to get too political, but it seems like, and if, in order for those women's rights and to be codified, you need to have, the flexibility or the to get the possibility of accepting and being inclusive. And this system has shown that it's not.
There is another question by Negar Bani Safar. Please go ahead, Negar.
Thank you, Professor Minuchehr, for your illuminating presentation. So I was wondering if, other than aberudari or like being modest, are there any other methods that pressure, like some subtle methods that pressure women to be silenced? So in Mali's case, I was wondering if there were any signs that could foreground that this future husband might turn out to be abusive, and then Mali, as a subject, ignored that, or maybe thought of it as being desired by the husband.
Yes,
because
yes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yes, actually, yes. But the thing is, what Tahmina Milani is showing is that love is blind, right? So you see those signs. Your family is telling you her Mali's parents weren't happy about the marriage or the possibility of, or the suitor. They were not. Her friends were telling her about this, and she saw, how suspicious this guy is, and still, love is blind, and still she accepted. She could not have ever imagined that she would be exposed to such abuse, and Tahmina Milani does a great job in showing, part of that abuse in the film. I mean, if you get a chance, if you haven't seen it, but I guess you have. But thank you. Yes, thank you for that question.
And another question by Dr. Purzand. She asked, do you see examples of women's solidarity and women organizing in any of these films? Of course, I know they are limited by the constraints of censorship.
Yes, actually, there is one Tahmina Milani movie. I'm blanking the name, but it is about this women's solidarity actually against the men. So they come together, collaborate, and they punish the men. And it's a really fascinating. It's an entertainment kind of movie. Yeah,
I think was it that one? Unsur Panjom or
واکنش پنجم.
واکنش پنجم. Sorry, yeah, I just translated it.
واکنش پنجم. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so that's like women's solidarity, and yeah, then you have her earlier movies, Two Women, also is sort of a kind of women's solidarity, and yeah, but that's a good point. Yeah, not we will probably see more of that kind of women's solidarity in the future. We hope.
You mentioned something about the first film that you showed us. You mentioned that it was actually a commercial release. So the question I have is, what does the fact that a film is commercial or a popular film or an independent art house film, does it have any impact on the representation of women in those films, and also on their reception by women in Iran, at least for the films that are shown in Iran?
Yes, those are very good questions. I'm sure that it does have some, so it does have some difference. I haven't really studied that difference, but it's a very good point that they may be, but this is a kind of movie that you would expect coming out of Iran's independent movie industry and not out of a commercial industry. But the fact that, Puran Darashande, got such great reviews and such great commercial, it became a commercial movie. So what I was trying to say is that it has a major impact on the social consciousness. So it is more than if it were in an independent house movie, because, not for instance, Kiarostami's movies, not many people watched it, not many people know about it, there are only these, even up to today, in Iran, people know about Kiarostami, but they may not have seen his films. But with Puran Darashand, with this He's, every woman I talked to when I visited had seen it, so I'm just, extrapolating from that, it had some kind of a social collective consciousness impact based on that. But what your point is about the whether it is made for commercial, they are representing women for commercial use. It's very much possible, it's very much possible that that's the case. So thank you.
Thank you. Just one last question, actually. Do you know who funded the film?
Good question. I think Puran Darashand was a producer herself. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. There's one last question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm not sure who else, but yes, she was her. I think she was one of the producers, if not the main.
So there's another question by Ashraf Rahmani. How do you think the present movement of Iranian women will affect the future movies on Iranian women?
I hope that there will be more women, more films, asserting those rights. I think now there is a social, a collective consciousness, as I mentioned. So I hope that there will be a future. We cannot read the future. I wish I could write the future in a different way, for the women, and in support of women. But thank you for that question. We're looking forward to a more positive future and better films about women. There is also another one about There Is No Evil.
Right. There is a comment. There Is No Evil by Rasulov is an example of an independent movie that is made in Iran without official permission and obviously not screened. The female characters in this film are what is more reflected in the women uprising today?
Yeah, so actually, I talked about There Is No Evil, on a panel for the Virginia Film Festival. It's a fabulous, amazing movie, and it's a major shame that Mohammad Rasulov is now in prison alongside with Jafar Panahi, who is also actually, and with many other film directors and poets and writers, and this is, and I wish for their release. And they are very progressive filmmakers, especially when it comes to the to their representation of female women in their films. So thank you for bringing up his name.
Okay, if there are no questions, I think I'm going to give back first I'm going to thank Dr. Pardis Minuchehr for her amazing talk and a great conversation. And I'm going to give back the tribune to Dr. Tavakkoli. Thank you so much, Dr. Minuchehr.
Thank you so much. Allow me to thank everybody for being here and listening to some of my ruminations. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Professor Tavakkoli, for the invitation.
I want to thank you again, Dr. Pardis Minuchehr, for your thoughtful and timely presentation at a time that we are all thinking about the prehistory of this inspiring cosmopolitan feminist movement in Iran. Thank you again, and we look forward to reading the fully finished article on Encyclopedia of Iranian Cinema, or Cinema Iranica. And likewise, I want to thank Gulbagh Kaptalai for outstanding moderation and introduction, and also look forward to reading and publishing your Bad Girls of Iranian Cinema.
Yes, and I look forward to reading your articles, and thank you so much for moderating, Professor Kaptalai, as well. And
thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in January.
Thank you.